we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Technical hiccups, but we were talking about Shakira.
Yeah, okay, listen. What's happening with Gerard Piqué and with Shakira is absolutely... So we're recording this in the end of January. So if anything else has happened, you best believe we are on it. So right now we're still stewing with what occurred. Can't believe he just posted the picture of him, of Clara.
How old is he?
Old enough to know better.
Wait, no, let me look at his age, because he seems to be doing that, like, I don't give a damn thing.
Well, he should. She's already made music about him.
35. Grow up.
She's already made songs about, like, him. And he thought this was gonna fly?
I also feel like she wouldn't have gone this far if he hadn't also got her in trouble with tax people and also made her live next to her in-laws.
Which she references in the song.
Yeah.
Anyways, this is Theoryish.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just gonna also give a quick note up top. This might sound a little bit differently than some of our other episodes. We're still figuring out the microphone and stuff, and our usual microphone is in my locker at uni and I just haven't been to uni in a while, so we haven't picked it up. We're currently recording from our house.
We is a strong word. You didn't tell me it was there and I was literally at uni.
I know, I'm so dumb. You went to uni so much and I just didn't tell you to get it.
Every day this week.
Yep.
And dramatically so, because I was like, I'm at uni. Hannah, what are we talking about today?
So today, I'm very nice for the listeners as well. We're actually looking at one of Sara Ahmed's blog posts from the blog Feminist Killjoys. So this will be freely available to anybody who wants to kind of read, follow along with us, all that kind of stuff. But I thought I would do a little introduction to Sara Ahmed and then an introduction to the actual text we're using, which is called Queer Use. So Sara Ahmed is a feminist writer and independent scholar. The text we're looking at today, as I said before, comes from Ahmed's research blog called Feminist Killjoys. Ahmed has previously stated that, quote, "To kill joy is to open a life, to make room for life, to make room for possibility, for chance," end quote. So the blog began when Ahmed was writing Living a Feminist Life, that looks at everyday experiences of being a feminist and uses these to rethink key aspects of feminist theory. And she's kind of carried on the blog since that point. Ahmed works at the intersection of feminist, queer, and race studies with a particular focus on bodies, worlds, power, everyday existences, and institutional cultures. Regarding Ahmed's feminism, in Living a Feminist Life, she states, quote, "I am not a lesbian one moment and a person of colour the next, and a feminist at another. I am all of these things at every moment, and lesbian feminism of colour brings all of this into existence with insistence, with persistence," end quote. Yeah, I know.
Such fire.
Just bars. So she was previously a professor of race and cultural studies at Goldsmiths University of London, but she actually resigned from her post in 2016 in protest at the university's failure to deal with the problem of sexual harassment. So you can actually read about this more in a post titled Resignation on Feminist Killjoys, and her recent book, Complaint, with an exclamation mark, also covers this topic in more detail by looking at what happens to complaints within university systems. Heartbreaking text, but really, really important. And personally, I actually really love Ahmed's work. In particular, I think that her way of writing and expressing ideas is incredibly engaging, creative, and Ahmed is always one of the people that comes to mind when I think about how I want to model my own writing. I personally use Ahmed's queer phenomenology, orientations, objects, and others in my own work. And that book discusses what it means for bodies to be situated in space and time using the term orientation as a focus, kind of in a similar way to how use is used as a focus in this text today. So, Paola, any thoughts on Sara Ahmed?
So this is my first time actually reading Sara Ahmed. So she's one of those sort of what happens with you with the other theory. It's a name that I keep hearing, and it has been my fault for not sitting down and reading it. It's also kind of the fault of my studies, where they're so focused on like a specific time period that I have to read a lot of the stuff within that time period, and I haven't done my homework. I need to read things that are in the now, and I am so glad that we read this really quite introductory friendly essay/lecture. It was fascinating. We spent a good amount of almost an hour sort of sifting through this text. It was so enriching because it didn't have one point, instead it had many different points that are happening at the same time, which really does go with a quote that you used about how she describes herself. Mm-hmm. She's not just a person of color and a lesbian, but these two things at the same time. This text is many different things at the same time, and it was so good. Yeah. It was so good.
Yeah, so today we're using Ahmed's blog post titled Queer Use from Feminist Killjoys, as I previously said. This was posted in 2018 and is a lecture script that Ahmed has used several times, starting from around 2016. It draws a lot from Ahmed's 2019 book, What's the Use? One of the Uses of Use. And this, like I said, this is freely available, and we're going to put a link in the description. The way this work kind of builds, like you were alluding to, Paola, it builds on itself. So I feel like the best way for us to go through this is to kind of take each point at a time. So we're not doing fan fiction today because this is quite a sensitive and very personal piece, I find. So I don't think that's applicable here. It's not relevant here. But we're also going to look kind of at the end of connections to pop culture or personal anecdotes, or you have an art piece, don't you, Paola? So
I do. I also wanted to come in and say, while yes, there may be fan fiction about this, I don't think this is an appropriate use for this, and this is something we talked about in our introduction. However, we're also going to be speaking from experiences, and we're going to be a little bit vulnerable this time around, and we hope that you give this piece as much as respect as you would give our stories. And with that, I think we should start.
Yeah, it's about 20 to 4 on a Sunday. It's very chill vibes,
We have our cups of tea.
Yeah. Yeah. Paola won't do it on the podcast, but she was doing a British accent earlier. It was very good.
It was not.
So Sara Ahmed actually uses queer in a really interesting way, and she kind of goes back to how queer was previously defined. So if you don't know, queer used to be a word that was used for people whose sexualities and genders were not considered normative, so they weren't straight and they weren't cisgendered, and it was used to kind of as a derogatory term. So if you were called queer, it was derogatory. So she talks about that kind of way, but she also talks about queer as in before any of that happened, how queer was used to define anything that was seen as odd or strange, unseemly, disturbed, or disturbing. And then she says queer, a sick feeling queer as in feeling nauseous. So queer is kind of used to describe anything that's noticeable because it's odd. Basically, Sara Ahmed kind of goes back to this beginning, more negative version of queer and uses it in a really productive way throughout this essay, and particularly towards the end kind of finale of the piece. So we will talk about that more kind of when we get to it, but that's how kind of queer is used.
She's setting up the original use of the word, kind of reminding people in a way of what it actually used to mean and why the word was co-opted and used on LGBTQ plus people, and why it was used. It was something that in society, if you were visibly queer, it would be disturbing. It was disruptive. It was uncomfortable. It was outside of the norm. And I think she does a really good job setting it up in this context to then break up into the larger multifaceted arguments because it's not one single argument, it's many arguments, but it's, yeah, no, it was fantastic.
So, if we dive in then to thinking about how use is used to guide the discussion, and this is important because it really starts to be developed on in the kind of latter half of this essay. So it's important to establish for the listeners as well as ourselves how use is used. So the first kind of bit that I have is about use and value. So she talks about how use is often a definer of value. So for example, a used book is cheaper, and she says, quote, the more signs of usage equals less value unless the user is esteemed, when the value of a person can rub off onto the value of a thing, end quote. So she also talks about Marx here, and how Marx talks about the material wear and tear in relation to machines. Something can get worn down by overuse, but it can also get worn down by underuse. So I think the example given is a sword left in a sheath, like rusting over time because it's not being used. So yeah, that's kind of the first starter. It reminded me a little bit of Benjamin, but I still haven't quite figured out how to pass that out in my brain.
Well, I was saying earlier that it's quite related to a Benjamin essay that you have not read and that we hope to cover in the future, when we forget about Benjamin for a second and then we're reminded of his glory once more. But it reminds me of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which you haven't read, so there's no point in like going into detail about it. But I think you're correct in having those connections. I also immediately thought of vinyl records, and I just started collecting vinyls because I'm over 30 and a hipster, so that's what you do. But certain things, even though they're used, have really a high quality value. For example, I bought my favorite Cure album, and it's much more expensive than a new freshly print. So I think this argument that she also put forth is a very interesting one, because it only works with things we don't consider of value already. So a used book, she uses this picture with someone like highlighting and like writing on the actual thing, and that deters its value. But meanwhile, if it's a record and it's someone famous touched it or someone famous wrote on it, what is the difference between those two things? Why is one worth more than the other? And I mean, she doesn't explicitly go into that in this text, but I suddenly thought of this. And it basically goes down to, we just see it as lesser than because it's not important to us.
She also, by the way, later in the essay actually talks about a famous person writing in a book. She talks about Charles Darwin writing in a personal copy of Lamarck's History Naturelle.
Histoire naturelle.
Yeah. And so Darwin actually disparages Lamarck in the margins of the book, and I think that's interesting because I've only just thought about it comes back later. But also there's a really interesting, when you were talking about, there's a picture of a book given, and she talks about how actually valuing use, we shouldn't romanticize it potentially, because it also shows how life has been extinguished. So she says, quote, with this book in my hands, I can tell others have been here before. I think about the reader who circled the word grief. I cannot trace you, but you left a trace. Use leaves traces in places, end quote.
Oh.
It's so good.
I cannot trace you, but you left a trace. It's so good.
Yeah. So thinking about how there's the connection between use and value, but there's also the connection of traces of use. So how use has happened previously, how signs of use, I guess, is the best way to say it. And then she starts to talk about use as instruction. So she gives the example of a toilet stall door. If it says like occupied, we know it's occupied, so space is occupation. There's also a really beautiful example, it's one of my favorite examples, and I think it's Ahmed's favorite example because it also features on the cover of What's the Use, and also using this essay is a picture of a postbox, and the postbox actually says, let me remember, birds nesting, please do not use this box, many thanks. And so she talks about how, and this is a quote, intended functionality can mean who something is for, not just what something is for. This means that something can be used by those for which it was not intended. And I think it's a really interesting example because it's both the postbox is out of use because it's being occupied by birds, but if you turn it on its head, it's also in use by the birds. The birds are nesting in the box. And she says this is kind of a definition of queer use. So when something is used for those whom it's not intended.
Yeah, I actually thought of, controversially, I thought of cruising zones. Specifically in New York, when you go to the Brambles in Central Park, it's notoriously known to be a gay cruising zone. And obviously, if you don't know, you don't know. But if you're in the know, you're in the know. And the Brambles, are like these little bridges and they're like dark spaces. And it was originally not intended for this use, but now it's infamously known for this. And, you avoid that part of the park if you're not going for that purpose. Or you get warned, someone tells you, hey, are you here for X, Y, and Z? And then you go, yes, or you go, no, and that changes how you interact with that space. Mm-hmm. So to have a more obvious queer use as an example. Yeah.
So it's interesting again to think about, and this is what I really like about Ahmed's work, right? This simple word that we use in our everyday existence is actually used by Ahmed to go off on all these different directions. Like you're saying, when we think about use, who is using it and what is considered proper use. And I think that's also interesting. So speaking of comings and goings. Use is an indication of comings and goings as well. This comes back quite strongly as a theme later, but she's talking about well-trodden paths. So the more a path is used, the more a path is used, which sounds strange. But basically, if something is in use, when you're looking at a path and you're looking at a patch of grass, there's a specific word for it, isn't it? When people take paths that are more convenient, there's a word for it.
Yeah, and I can't remember.
I can't remember it off the top of my head. What's it called? Desire paths.
Speaking of the Brambles.
So if we think of desire paths, which is, say you've got a corner, often people will miss the corner and walk across the grass, and then you'll see the grass get worn away. So the idea is that path is more used than the actual path that's been put in place.
Yeah, the intended path versus the one that is organically created.
Mm-hmm. And so she says, quote, collectivity can be acquired as direction. The more a path is travelled upon, the clearer it becomes, end quote. And the example she gives here is heterosexuality is a path that is kept clear, thinking about queer use and things like this. So what she means by this is that heterosexuality is seen as the norm, the normal path. And if you don't go towards heterosexuality and you start dating somebody of the same sex, then you're seen as going off that path. Potentially, maybe, depending on who you are, into a path that's not been travelled by anybody you know or anybody your family knows and things like that. And that's where difficulties can arise.
Yeah, it's also why visibility and queer demonstration is so important. When the path is not clear, it becomes alien and it becomes frightening. You see a sign that says keep off grass, you would keep off that grass. But if you see even if the sign is there and there's already when the grass is kind of flattened and the rocks are popping out and it looks muddier than the rest of the grass, you're like, well, the sign says don't walk on the grass, but obviously other people have trotted on it before. Henceforth, I can probably do it. Even if I get in trouble, there is already a visible sign that says, hey, yeah, I'll get in trouble this once, but I can just do it again.
Yeah. And other people haven't got in trouble. I might not get in trouble as well following that path. She also kind of says, quote, when it's harder to proceed, when a path is harder to follow, you might be discouraged. You might try and find another route. End of quote. So there's also this idea of use as actually becoming ease of passage. If something is more often used, it becomes easier to go through. So this kind of comes up again later in a more hard-hitting way. So we now get a bit more complicated and we start thinking about use as not using something can also mean it's not being or not existing. So she's saying an example that's given is the way land use is thought of in Western culture previously and sort of still. It was understood in terms of cultivation. So if land was not being cultivated, it was deemed out of use. And she says, quote, it becomes wasteland, unused, and thus available to be appropriated, end quote. So she's talking about the ways in which use can differ.
Yeah, it works twofold in that, especially her example is great because you think about land that was not in use in terms of like Latin Americas and all of that would be land that was not used for capitalistic gain. So it's land that was seized, abandoned, and mistreated because it didn't go the way that it wanted to, and that, you know, we're still dealing with the aftermath of this. And then land that's in use is being abused and exploited. And I think a way to also look at like how unused uses can be exploitative is it's a simple one, but Las Vegas. It was the middle of the desert. No one wanted that land, so the mob came in, bought it for cheap, and then turned it into a capitalistic hellscape, which I would love to attend. But it's when something is not in use, it can also be vulnerable to what use is then being put upon it. This text there's so many different ways and many different footpaths to create with what is written, and it's so good. I'm gonna keep gushing every single time. It's so good.
I think it's also deceptively simple, right? Like on the face of it, a lot of this stuff is simple and it makes sense, right? When Sara Ahmed is saying this to us, we go, oh yeah, of course, I understand that. But when it starts to get mixed together, particularly later on in the essay, that's where some of the brilliance starts to come forth. Again, it's another reason why I like Sara Ahmed's work. It's just simple brilliance, right? So use of use is use as happenstance. So she talks about Darwin. There's a lot of stuff about biology in that section that I'm kind of going to gloss over. But she uses Darwin's use of the architect metaphor. Quote, you are more likely to use a stone that happens to fit that space. Use as use as happenstance, use as even happy, end quote. Essentially, the idea of use then here is if you're building a wall and you're having to use the materials that are just around you, you're going to use the materials that look like they fit versus the materials that don't look like they fit. And again, this is quite simple here, but it starts to get more complicated when she starts talking about people and institutions. If we think about them queer use, and this is kind of dotted throughout, but I brought it all together in kind of one place. There's three kind of main ways that I see a queer use being used. So queer use can be deemed as something called perverted use. She uses an example of the multiple uses of a key. So I don't know if you ever see it, but if people are trying to entertain a baby, sometimes they'll like wiggle keys in front of them, jingle them. And she says, you don't call the child who turns a key into a toy a pervert. Even if that's not what the key is for, the child is expected to play with things. But if you think about this in terms of gendered expressions of play, you think about a boy playing with what is deemed the wrong toy. So her example is a Hoover, but if you even take like dolls or like Barbies as an example, if a boy is playing with a Barbie, they might be understood as perverted or on their way to perversion. And correcting the boy's use of the toy is more about correcting the behavior in relation to the toy. It's about correcting how the boy is meant to behave as a boy. way. And so use then can become perverted in that way.
Yeah, it actually made me think of King Louis the 16th, I think. It was the last king who, speaking of keys, he had a hobby for making locks. So he worked with a lot of keys, and for a long time he was jeered because he was more interested in his keys than in women. And it was perverted into like him being potentially gay. And, you know how all these things go. We don't really know if he was or not, or maybe he was just more interested in keys than personal relationships. You know, there might have been a plethora of things, and we're not gonna like couch psychiatry do this. But his simple hobby, which was the least harmful thing about him, was perverted in that way. And that can go into many, many different things. And politically, like what's happening in the States right now with queer, drag?
Oh, yeah. Not just in the States, here.
Yeah, like the drag reading being perverted. And it's just like, well, this is, terrible human behavior. And it's just like, no, we have been cross-dressing since the beginning of time, and I can say that because I'm a literal historian working on cross-dressing. And it's being perverted to become like a fetishization, whereas kids don't see it that way. And neither do the adults, unless the content is specifically made to be perverted. And these things permeate in many different ways, not just in queer aspects, but also when it comes to even internalized gender roles. Men afraid to cook because they don't want to look unmasculine. Women afraid to lift weights or to be a little bit sporty and afraid to look unfeminine. And it's the gendering. It's not just gendering, but it is the creating a mythos for objects that are just simply objects, and that in turn makes the person that uses them an object themselves, because instead of looking at a little boy with a Hoover, you're going, well, that little boy shouldn't be touching that, because the Hoover and him become one, and they kind of fuse together. And the Hoover's an extension of his psyche, his way of acting, and then that needs to be corrected. And that makes the child then immediately into an object that needs to be fixed. You need to run a software update or something. So I think it extends not just to the object or the use of the object, but the use of the person.
And we're thinking about perversion here, because when you hear perverted, it's like a very strong word. But essentially what Sara Ahmed is saying is, for example, a lot of parents, unfortunately, wouldn't want their sons to be gay. And so if they see their sons doing something like playing with a Hoover, playing with Barbies, like you're saying, it's perverting their expectations of that child and what their child is meant to be in their eyes and as a thing that belongs to them almost. And so the boy must be fixed, as you're saying. She's also talking about queer use as something that is used by those for whom it was not intended. So like you were saying with the park example, that use of the bushes potentially isn't intended for raunchy gay sex. But that's what it's being used for, right?
As it should.
Yeah. And so exactly. And so, even in that example, you can think about the ways that space is prevented from being used by those for whom it was not intended. If we think of a derelict abandoned house, if people start living in it without paying for it, they're deemed as squatters, and often, people will come, the police will come and try and get them out the house, and courts will come and try and sue them, all that kind of stuff. I don't quite know how it all works, but essentially, even though they're using a space that wasn't being used, it's being used by those who were not seen as the intentional users of that space. And so that's another kind of form of queer use.
And it also goes back to what we stated earlier in the value in the thing. A squatter is reduced to an object that is using a space that it shouldn't. So if they can't make money off of this, even though it's not in use, they're going to get them out. Because it's not about providing a welfare. it is about the value of the use. And when they're valueless in their eyes, in means of like capitalistic gain, then what's the point in having them there?
And so the last kind of main way I see queer use being spoken about is when discussing like norms and normative actions. So this is a little bit complicated, but she does do a good job of like unpicking it. The example she gives is of a giraffe. And if you think about evolution, giraffes' necks got longer to be able to reach higher up branches and food and things like that. And so she talks about, quote, when effort becomes normal, a form is acquired. When such form is acquired, less effort is needed. The giraffe does not have to reach so high to reach the foliage. Use inheritance translates as the lessening the effort required to survive within an environment. End quote. So essentially what this is referring to is how we change ourselves in relation to our environment in order to survive within that environment. And Paola had a really good example of homonormativity, which we have defined in a previous episode, but let's do it here again, just in case.
Yeah, I'm going by the Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz, which is an excellent text. I haven't read it in a while, so this is going to be a very butchered definition. But homonormativity is when people of the LGBTQ+, adopt heterosexual modes of living. So think of the nuclear family and sort of the introduction of that family lifestyle, like white suburbia, picket fence, statistical numbers of family production. Obviously works a little bit different with adoption or someone that is a surrogate for a relationship. Obviously there is a difference between homonormativity and heteronormativity. However, at the end of the day, it is trying to claim a normative status quo within a space. And where homonormativity is quite dangerous is that usually it adopts an expulsion of anything that is not what is considered status quo heteronormative norms. So anyone that is into, for example, leather or BDSM or polyamory.
Kink at Pride is the thing.
Kink at Pride, yeah. And sort of reducing other people's experiences and being judgmental or feeling queasy and uncomfortable kind of reduces the word queer, which is Sara Ahmed's big statement piece in the beginning. So I think homonormativity is a really good example in that way, where you're just trying to blend in, you're trying to be accepted at the cost of everyone else in your community. And where that can get into really dicey territory is by historical erasure of how they got to homonormativity in the first place, which is people that were willing to disrupt the system, a la Marsha P. Johnson, you know? It was built up upon figures that were willing to take the unbeaten path and to lead the way. And it's the forgetfulness of the privilege of normativity.
It's really interesting, just like side note. So what came before gay liberation, which is kind of Marsha P. Johnson, Stonewall, is something called the homophile movement, which were mainly gay men, but there were lesbian women there, and they didn't really accept people who were gender non-conforming, but they really just wanted to blend into society. They just wanted to kind of be left alone. We won't make any fuss if you won't come to us and damage us, and that's kind of where gay liberation was born out of. But gay liberation movements were often some of them very communist in their ideas, so very anti-capitalist. You also get very anti-marriage. And it's really interesting how we've almost gone not backwards, but we've almost gone further into that kind of homonormativity, because now, rather than the homophile movement, which was like, leave us alone, after gay liberation, you get movements that are like, please accept us. And we want to be recognized by the state in that acceptance. That's how we get accepted. And we might cover it in the future, but if you're interested in this, Jasbir Puar's book on homonationalism terrorist assemblages, I believe is what it's called.
Yes.
Talking about homonationalism and how this kind of moves into the exclusion of queer people who do not exist within these state parameters. And it's way more complicated than that, so we'll kind of leave that there. But it's interesting to think about, like, if we think about this queer inheritance as, like, lessening the effort required to survive within an environment, who gets included and excluded from that space. And this is a kind of tension that Sara Ahmed starts to bring out, and then it goes almost back in on itself. And I imagine, I haven't read What's the Use, but I imagine that goes into these complexities a little bit more.
She's very, very careful not to say, well, it's because X, Y, and Z. It is way more complicated, and it's reflected in the way she's writing. It's very open. Nothing's really defined. We're sort of having to define for ourselves.
Yeah.
So obviously you can read this text after you listen to us and have a completely different view of this as well. Yeah, so just also adding that in there.
Yeah, one kind of just last point on the kind of queer use, one thing that she says is actually thinking about this pull of the past on the present. So she's using Elizabeth Freeman's work around temporal drag, which is complicated, so I won't really pull that apart here. But if we think about the past and the present, this comes back later. And also the idea of creatively coming up with solutions from what you have on hand. This is also important and comes back later. So if we then move on to thinking about institutions, which is the kind of second part of this piece and the bulk of the piece.
And also the reason why we decided not to use fan fiction.
Yeah. One of the things that Sara Ahmed starts to talk about is people she defines as diversity workers. So diversity workers are, quote, trying to transform institutional habits, not to follow the well-used paths, and not to go with the way things flow, end quote. So if I think of diversity workers, it's kind of people that push for anti-racist pedagogy, and pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. So the inclusion of gender-inclusive bathrooms, push for
disability inclusion and immigrant work, and helping with transition from one country to another. So diversity is a big word, and it's a very complicated word because there's also fields in which people don't think about diversity, like age inclusion. Or exclusion in that way as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Diversity work is a broad category. So if you look at the word diversity, I imagine you as a listener will also come up with your own understandings of what this term means to you. But I think Sara Ahmed does a really good job of trying to capture what diversity means without trying to pin it down to a specific thing. Mm-hmm. And Ahmed's very critical of the way diversity is used within institutions as a whole. And Ahmed's kind of thinking in the background is the university is the institution we're talking about, but this can apply to lots of different institutions. So she says, quote, "The word diversity is used more because it does less. Diversity becomes a sign of the difficulty of getting through," end quote. And I think that's a really good way of saying diversity, like we're saying, it means lots of things, but institutionally it can also mean nothing, right?
Yeah, it just becomes an echo of a word that is useless. And I can say, I've been through institutions obviously in the US and here in the UK, and it's a word that gets reused over and over again in like English Western institutions, and it just becomes meaningless. It's like, oh, this is our diversity and inclusion class, and it's like, okay, but what does that mean? What?
Yeah.
And it's an hour long on a subject that is so vast, and in the end it doesn't help anyone. I mean, it proposes, to act like a decent human being and to not say things you wouldn't say to someone you cared about is basically the point of many of these courses, and I see why it's being used, but these things are not going to be solved with a PowerPoint presentation for an hour and a half, especially if it's given in person. It's a very sensitive subject and topic, and it doesn't translate well because diversity looks very different to every single person.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody who's listening has ever had to go through it, but do you know there's like, if you're in a job, they're like, oh, we must do like a little diversity thing that you have to go through to say, so that the institution can tick the box and be like, okay, well, none of our people are racist because they went through this course. And that's actually not how it works.
I will not say the institution. If you don't know what I look like, I'm Puerto Rican. I was born in Puerto Rico. First language is Spanish. I was in this institution and, I have a big curly hair. I'm pale, but I'm racially ambiguous. And this institution wanted to do a photo op with me because I looked racially ambiguous. Of course I said no, because my face would have been in advertisements and still would have been in advertisements for an institution I really don't really care that much about. But it's like diversity and inclusion at my own exploitation. And I would have been doing this for free as well. There was no payment. It was just like, please model. And that institution went to everyone of color. And specifically women of color, especially hijabi women. And it was trying to propose this like idea of like, we're so diverse and inclusive, and it didn't feel that way. No one with disabilities was asked. No one that had invisible disabilities, no one that was older was asked to participate. We were all young, able-bodied women, and it was so nasty.
And there's so many stories of students within universities getting asked to take part in these photo shoots, and then they're like plastered all over the university website. And the idea is like, look at us, we're so diverse. But then you get these students turn around and be like, I was the only person of color. So are you diverse? Or are you just trying to give you the impression that you're diverse?
It's really deaf. And it's also a really complicated situation because obviously you don't just want to have white faces plastered all over your material, but at what point does diversity become exploitation?
And it's really, it can get quite tricky. You want to be representational, but then you toe the line of like, oh, I don't want to go to these specific people just to be like, can I talk to you and can you talk about race? Because that will make us seem more diverse. It has to happen naturally. And doing that natural inclusion of people, that takes a lot of institutional work. And quite often it's not what institutions want to or are able to do.
It's the fine line between an organic circumstance and performativity. The main point of what we were both saying is that diversity can turn into novelty, and it becomes just a use, and it goes back to that land example where it's being exploited. And it's like, oh, this isn't in use. Let's see how we can work with it. And obviously, things are changing for better and for worse. It is twofold. But at this moment in time, I see things getting slightly better and people able to speak out a lot more, which is another point that Ahmed's piece here that states it.
Yeah, so another way that Ahmed defines diversity workers is as institutional plumbers. Quote, they have to work out not only where something is blocked, but how it is blocked, end quote. So if a policy, for example, is prevented from being put into place, you not only have to investigate, okay, how did it get prevented here, but how has it been prevented in many different forms? And that doesn't have to always be as explicit as minutes from a meeting that say this isn't the way it's going to be. I'll talk about it in a little minute, but Ahmed talks about non-performativity or how agreement becomes inaction, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about that. But I just wanted to kind of end my little discussion of diversity workers by saying that diversity workers can also seem to herald kind of bad vibes for people. So if you're pointed out as being a diversity worker or a troublemaker in people's eyes, they almost treat you as a troublemaker no matter what you do. So she says that, quote, "We imagine the eyes rolling as if to say, well, she would say that." And she says rolling eyes is a form of feminist pedagogy, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, we do it. When someone says something that we both either agree or disagree with, we make facial remarks. You know, we have an entire conversation with our eyes and our brows and the way our mouths move, like or you know, and that one's verbal because obviously we're on an audio format, but we can, you know, it's how we communicate. And yeah, I didn't think about the eyebrows. Yeah, I was like, wow, Sarah,
yeah.
Damn, girl.
And I don't know if we've kind of sort of said it, but I'll bring it up here just in case. You were talking earlier about diversity for diversity's sake.
So, especially with this section that you just read, it is about the fear of the diversity person coming in. I think they're called diversity officers. So it's also like an institutionally made force for diversity, and that is diversity for diversity's sake. And what we were talking about earlier, it was like the exploitation of diversity, but diversity for diversity's sake is using people as a check mark. It's like, look, we hired a person of color, we hired a person that is queer, and if they're, what was it, there's this, have you seen 30 Rock? It is dated, and certain characters on that show are now probably going to jail because of what they did. But there's this character on the show that's a writer, and they call him Twofer because he's black and he went to Harvard. So they call him a 2-for-1.
Yeah.
As a diversity hire. And obviously it's a joke about how boardrooms go, but that's also diversity for diversity's sake. I remember, I love the show. It's one woman who's queer, but they don't really reference her at all. She's just there in the corner. But they do mention the obviously black character from Harvard who they call Twofer. And I don't remember her even having a name, but he did. And that it's actually an ongoing problem specifically in Hollywood, which I'm a little bit more familiar with. I'm not really familiar how the BBC and how television programs here work that well. But in the States, they usually have a thing called a diversity hire. They don't want to say it, but it exists, where they hire a person, usually an up-and-coming writer or an up-and-coming comedian, to have that place, and they usually don't pay them very well. So once they are writing on the show, which is a very difficult position to get because it's usually one position rather than 5 or 6, they finally get it, they do an amazing job, or they do a medium, it doesn't matter, they do their job. And they've gained that experience. That means they have something on their resume. So when that job ends, because it will end, because that's how television writing works, and they go on to another job, they're going to be unhireable because they have more experience and they don't want to pay for that experience. So that is diversity for diversity's sake. It's not just like the representation, but also the financial incentives that companies have that really undermine people that are in the outskirts of the norm for that specific field.
So kind of adjacent to this, there's an interesting thing that Sara Ahmed starts to talk about when it comes to institutions and how they make decisions for things. And if we think about an institutional decision, let me give another university example. But if something gets written into policy, and if you've ever been behind the scenes at a university, which I have many times, and I think you have, Paola, haven't you? Yeah. You get to see, like, oh, there's this document that says this and this and this. And if you dig deep enough, you'll actually start to figure out these documents are never really referred to. They're kind of just like placed to one side. And quite often as well, some of these documents, like, they contradict each other. So you also get like, oh, this committee put this into place, but then this other committee put this into place. But it doesn't matter because usually universities are really just doing this to say that they're done, right? And so an example that Sara Ahmed brings up is if there's an institutional decision, individuals within the institution must act as if the decision has been made for it to have been made. If they do not, it has not. So say a policy is put into place. If people don't acknowledge that policy or ever bring it up again, does the policy exist? You know, if a tree falls in the wood and no one hears it, did the tree fall? Yeah.
Well, it's also used to quench the flames because, I can't talk about the institution. However, I will say the thing. I was an intern at an institution, and there was a big case. I had to talk about it very vaguely, but if you know me, you can put many pieces together. But something had occurred to a student, and the institution went to legal, and they put up all these things, and they created an app so they can avoid the situation happening again, but they never compensated for the student in question. And because that was the easiest way to maintain the image of the institution, rectify in the eyes of the public what they did and didn't do, and just threw this person under the bus.
Sara Ahmed calls it dynamic non-performativity, when naming something does not bring it into effect, or when something is named in order not to bring something into effect. And she starts to talk about, and she talks about this a lot more in Complaint, agreement as preventing diversity work, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it actually is a thing that happens and is very frustrating when it comes to universities. So an example she gives in Complaint is actually when people are nodding to make it seem like they're listening, but they're not actually telling you they'll do anything. You just think you're being heard because somebody's sitting there and nodding at you and listening to you. And she's got so many examples in that Complaint book of, for example, PhD students going to their supervisors, and as soon as they go, I want to put in a formal complaint, the supervisor's whole attitude changes. Instead of being helpful and listening like they were previously, now they're having a problem.
Yeah, it's the passivity of a nod. And it's, once more, it's back to performance. You're pretending to care, which is such a rough thing to say, but you're pretending to care, and then once the thing is said aloud, you just go, okay, moving on.
And this is where Sara Ahmed starts to go into how this work can be so exhausting, right? If you're sat there and it's took you maybe a year, 2 years, the Complaint book goes into it more, the time frames of getting stuff sorted is ridiculous. But say you put in a complaint with the university and you spend a few months trying to get an answer to an email. Then you finally get the answer to the email. You spend a few months trying to sort a meeting. You finally sort the meeting. You spend a few months trying to sort another meeting. It's, even if it's weeks, even if it's days, you've got this stuff weighing on you and you become exhausted. And say, eventually you go through and you get what you want out of the complaint, a diversity policy is written up. And Sara Ahmed says a diversity policy can come into existence without coming into use. And this is a really tough thing that happens, this exhaustion that happens to diversity workers.
Yeah, it's the constant battle upwards. And then even if you get to the top of the mountain, what's to say you're not going to roll back down?
Like I was saying, and like you're saying, it can make you feel exhausted or unable or unwilling to do the work. This has started to happen to me. I used to work in well-being, I used to work in diversity and inclusion, all this kind of stuff. And battling against the uni becomes quite hard. And it also starts to have very negative impacts on how people see you and perceive you.
Uni as the institution itself.
Yeah, not this specific one.
No. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And, I have a background in working within the administrative side of institutions. And what's truly sad about all of this is that, for the most part, these things happened not because people are maliciously trying to undo these things. It's because it's the nature of the institution and how it's built itself. I remember professors feeling so frustrated, and even the heads of departments feeling frustrated with the university itself, with the president of the university or a certain branch of the university or the shareholders. Because at the end of the day, institutions are businesses in a way. And there's always someone higher up that is going to put a block. So it's also just really, really disheartening to see, for example, someone you really respect and admire breaking down. So this part of it was very triggering, because I just remember certain things that just were incredibly important and beneficial for not just students, but for professors themselves, and to protect the professors themselves as well, that just fell by the wayside because eventually, maybe their contract was up. The student graduated and went to another institution, and no one was willing to pick up the battle again. Or they saw the battle and was just like, I only have one more year left. Am I going to spend it doing this?
And so Ahmed talks about it in Complaint a bit more, about how usually this is the point of complaints processes. They're meant to wear you out. But to bring us back to a kind of lighter, more activist note, I guess, I've got an example here that I'll put in the description. Actually, two examples. One comes from Akugo Emijulu and Leah Bassel, who write about the politics of exhaustion as a way of understanding women of colour's activist work. So this is an article. The other thing I will say is I know Akugo has written about exhaustion like in other places that are freely available. So this kind of article says that declaring exhaustion is to actually get all the equally exhausted people to build solidarity. So in this exhaustion, you can find connection with other people. And the other example I wanted to give was from Audre Lorde and the original idea of self-care. So not in the university or the social media way of self-care, which is like go and have a bath and like read a book and go and meditate for 5 minutes. I hate being told to meditate.
Yeah, I had so to sort of start linking towards the end of this podcast, we were discussing how self-care is so internalized by not just academic institutions, but by institutions in like just the workforce, where they tell you, remember to take part in your self-care. Mm-hmm. And it's usually at the expense of the person in pain. I was very lucky when I worked in the States. I had self-care days in which were paid days or hours off. And that was like quite nice, but it's not taken into consideration that the self-care is needed because of these structures that are built upon the work that required the self-care to occur.
Yeah. And this self-care narrative only got kind of worse during COVID, especially when people were at home really struggling. I know I really struggled. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Audre Lorde says that, quote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. End quote. So it's this idea that you're not self-caring for the self, you're self-caring to essentially become a member of a community and to look after other people in that community, that collective, the other people around you, so that you all can work towards a specific goal. Say at universities, for example, say we wanted to get gender inclusive bathrooms put in one place, and it sounds like a simple task. It's often not. Even if the building's not even built yet, putting that into the design is ridiculously hard. So
also it can be something even as small as self-care is getting a decent work hour so that you can sleep and then show up fully rested the next day for class and give the students that are paying to be there a really worthwhile experience because you are not stressed out.
Yeah.
It is a ripple effect.
And so Sara Ahmed also says that alternatively, or in conjunction with feeling exhausted, you might also fly off the handle. And there's really, you have to read it.
Good picture.
There's good pictures, there's good references to mugs. You just need to go and look at it.
It's like onomatopoeia visually.
It's so good. But she says, if you fly off the handle, you're snapping or losing your temper. And she says, quote, to lose a handle on things can mean to lose yourself. You become the one who cannot handle it, end quote. So essentially, this diversity work, even though it's supposed to be good, productive work, can end up having very negative impacts on the individual. And if you're not connected to other people within your institution, or if you're feeling very isolated in this work and you don't have those safety nets, almost, those people to catch you when you fall, your support networks, that's what I'm trying to say.
I'm supporting you there, then.
You're essentially, you start to lose a grip of yourself, of who you are, of what your purpose is. And yeah, it can be extremely damaging.
Yeah, and in turn, it could be used to say that you are uncompliant, difficult to work with, etc., because you don't fit into the mold.
Yeah.
Instead of the mold not existing, one, or there being space for mistake or space to recover.
So just to kind of go off in a different direction, like Sara Ahmed does, she says, quote, I remember one time a woman of colour was considered for a job. She worked on race and sexuality, and some said in a departmental meeting with concern, but we already have Sarah, as if having one of me was more than enough, end quote. So this can work in multiple ways. It can be, we already have the diversity person.
The two, for example.
Yeah, we already have that person, we don't need another. Or we already have a troublemaker, why would we bring in a second? Or she also says in this kind of bit, she starts to talk about they deem their work similar because they both work on race and sexuality. But Sara was like, actually, our work is not the same at all. And so what I also find happens, if we think academically, when you have work that is on topics such as race, sexuality, gender, feminism, people choose to brush off this importance of this work. I had a friend the other day say that her work was being brushed off as being about the oppression of women by men. That was like legitimately what they said. That's not the case at all. But that happens all the time. Your work is deemed not important because, oh, well, we already get it. We get it, so it's not complex enough.
It's not even that. I think it's just reduced to its bare bones. It happens a lot with what I study, where I say I study cross-dressing and they automatically assume I do queer studies. And I use queer studies, I use queer theory, I use a lot of queer theory, but that's not what I do. I work on masculinity, and it can include queerness, but it's not always queer. Sort of what we're circling about and trying to land on, I think, is the Eurocentric visions of what diversity looks like. And it's the reduction of one's subject to encompass every single thing. How many modern European historians do we have in this world versus the one or two Latinx historians that are supposed to cover multiple nations and backgrounds and complicated circumstances, even down to linguistics. And they're supposed to cover all of that. At my very, very old institution, we had an Egyptologist. And that poor person had to also cover a lot of African stuff, even though their specialty was Egypt.
Yeah.
And it's gotten better. We at that old institution, we got a new head of department that was very aware of the problems that were occurring and was also aware of student complaints, and things were better off, but that also takes a really long time.
Yeah. And it also takes those people coming in at higher places and being like, look, this isn't on and we need to change it. But even if you just have that one person, sometimes that's not enough.
No.
Going back to what Sara Ahmed was saying about Darwin and the use of the architect metaphor, people often get chosen for positions because they happen to fit rather than because of how the structure was built. And what I kind of mean by this is that these structures are in place already. And she gives a really interesting example of people on a hiring committee going, oh, well, we just decided to hire this person because they seem like the kind of person that could go down the pub with us, right? And there is something to be said for
personality, blending into the department, in a more interpersonal way.
Yeah, but that's not what they mean by it. They mean like, I want somebody who can be my bestie and who's kind of similar to me, and that's more damaging, right?
It's also reducing it and putting the blame on the other person for not blending in, especially probably a new academic who's still getting their bearings. And, you know, instead of taking this opportunity as a way to be a mentor and to be someone that is impactful to this person's life, they're like, well, you're not working with what we set up as the status quo. And a lot of people of color have this problem, and we talked about it briefly. The bread.
It's bread time.
It's bread time.
Sorry. It is bread time. Apologies, Paola is baking.
Yeah, and also we might get another interruption because I'm making bread and it's not browned enough. It's still in like the light gold stage, and I want her to be brown. I want her to be tan.
Yeah, so...
Big baker.
Yeah. So we might have another bread interruption, but you know, cozy vibes.
This is our relaxed fit. If you listen to last podcast on the left, this is our relaxed fit.
Yeah.
Even though it is so deep.
We're getting deep. But you know, you said it kind of earlier before we started recording that there's actually an issue, specifically in academia, but also in some other places, about it lives between this kind of professional and personal space. This is why connections are seen as like very important, and so expectations end up in this like weird place.
So we were talking about how academia specifically, because that's what we're most familiar with and what the text is about at the end of the day, it is about how odd like the position of a professor is, where you are expected to be not just the person in charge of the classroom, where you are the worker, you are creating the lesson plan, you're reading all these things, you're the authoritative figure, and you are a provider of knowledge, but also you're sort of the help for your student or even for your fellow colleagues. You are expected to be part of committees. You're expected to work for certain things within the institution. Even worse if you work in a primary or secondary school, where you have to show up for like a dance or to chaperone or to do all these other things that are extracurriculars to your job. And at the same time, you have to, especially we've had these situations with students where they tell us very personal things. And while we are thankful and we're really happy that they feel comfortable enough to share that with us, that puts us in a very precarious situation in which we're both teacher, friend, and therapist.
Yeah. And oftentimes you're not given the training to conduct this kind of work. You know, it's no secret that a lot of people who work in race, gender, and sexuality are the people who, you know, in the instances of race, or if you're a visible person of color, you get asked by students, you know, this person's being racist to me, how do I deal with this? And sometimes maybe you don't have the answer, or maybe it's complicated, or maybe you would like something to be done, but you know it won't be. Same goes for sexual harassment things. You know, I've had students in the past, particularly when I was doing well-being work, where they came up to me and they were like, this happened and this made me feel unsafe. What are we supposed to do? What can you do? You can go to the proper channels, but there's no... Sara Ahmed, you know, like I said in the beginning, left Goldsmiths because they were not dealing with sexual harassment things. And so, yeah, what do? There's no
answer.
Yeah.
And even like this is going to be a very lighthearted example, because I purposely kind of waited to say this one to sort of, because this is a very intense...
Yes, it is. It gets intense, yeah.
I was technically not in the position of staff yet, and a student saw me as a person of color that's also a lot older than them, and it's also queer, and they came out to me. And I was just trying to have a pint, I just sat down, the student saw me at the pub, and I was like, oh, hi, what up? And the student was like, hi, bestie. And I was like, we're not best friends, but go off. And then they came out to me and told me all of their trauma. And I'm just like, in front of my salad?
Yeah.
And it's like, there's no off switch. I used to be quite angry at professors that just like clocked in, clocked out, but now I'm starting to get it.
Yeah, I've had students come up to me, and I do sexuality and stuff, and I've had students come up to me and talk about very sexually explicit things because it's related to queer theory, but I'm like, if anybody drops into this conversation, they're going to think this is extremely inappropriate. And you want to both validate that student's experiences and that they're wanting to talk about, sex and sexuality. But then you also, on the flip side, have the difficulty of it's not entirely appropriate all the time for you to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've taught on a module about relationships and kind of sex education, and it stopped being about education and it started being a whole conversation about consent. And I was like, I was not prepared for this in this classroom. I was not ready for these 18, 19-year-olds to not understand consent.
And these...
Bread! Sorry. Okay, so...
We're back.
Back from the bread.
And she's looking thick. A nice lighthearted break from a very intense conversation.
Yeah, we're gonna take it back out right now because we've been recording for almost 2 hours and I did not expect that.
Yeah.
There's a lot in here.
Yeah, it's usually with these essays, there's so much to say because it's not defined, and we just end up on a rabbit hole, which is a welcome one. I think this essay is so illuminating. The
last things that I kind of want to focus on is, number one, Sara Ahmed says the privilege is a set energy saving device. Quote, less effort is required to pass through when a world has been assembled around you, which is a really, it's a really just incredible way of thinking about privilege. I just don't think a lot of people, especially people with privilege, think about when it comes to privilege and the way that, I quite often hear, especially white people, say that, oh, well, I'm not being actively racist, or I'm not being actively homophobic, or I'm not being actively this, without realizing that privilege doesn't work in that way. It's not what you are doing. It's just how you exist within the world and under white supremacy. And so, yeah, I just wanted to bring up that part because I think it's really interesting and relevant, and I wanted to highlight it if people hadn't already seen it.
We had a really good analogy about the work that we did when we were in undergrad and how it's affecting us now. And I say that, and I don't think you guys expect the turn that we're going to take. So both Hannah and I worked, minimum wage jobs. You worked at a pub. I worked at a nameless coffee chain in the States. And, we worked on our feet a lot. And here in the UK, you're allowed to actually sit down for your job, and in Europe as well. But in the States, you're not allowed to sit down. So, I was working 35 to 40 hours a week, and I did that for 4 or 5 years. And at the time, I was trying to survive. I got as good of a grades as people of the same year as me, but, they had the privilege to not have to work minimum wage because they either were very, very talented and they got a scholarship, or they had family money. And I like to include the scholarship one because it is a different form of privilege. It is very earned, it's very hard worked, but it's still a privilege, as we are both privileged to even just be speaking about this. But now, several years later, the two of us have injuries, and I'm developing arthritis in my wrist. I have to be very careful. I have to even just to like sit down at a desk, I have to do stretches on my IT band. I have issues with my knee. You also have knee issues and shoulder issues from repetitive motion.
Yeah, and hips. I feel it in my hips when I'm sitting down.
Yeah, and we're quite young, you know?
Yeah, I'm 27. What is happening?
I'm in my 30s.
So,
but these things are, it's like an actual physical manifestation of like what privilege looks like. Colleagues of ours that grew up in better economic circumstances or didn't have to do any of this type of work do not have the same type of injuries we have to deal with, which are chronic. And I think it's a really good way of sort of explaining how privilege works. Because yes, they can have an injury from something else, but it's not the same. People can be far worse than us. We're very lucky that we have access to physical therapy to help us with these things, because in other places they don't even have that.
And you've also got things like, I currently work on top of the PhD, so I do 30 hours of work on top of the PhD. The PhD is self-funded, but not in the fun self-funded, my parents are paying for it kind of way. In the, I didn't have the grades to get funding, so I just went through and was like, I can do this by myself, self-funded. And you've also got the thing of the COVID-19 pandemic, which wiped out my savings and a lot of other people's, right?
Yep.
So if I'm thinking about a 30-hour work week, as well as 20 to 25 hours on my PhD, because it's part-time, as well as trying to find space in my week to eat, relax, exercise, God knows else what, like, that impacts me now as well as in the future. God knows what health things are going to come from my current diet and my ability to exercise and all that kind of stuff. And especially if you're like me and Paola, you almost sacrifice your youthful body in order to ensure you live a restful old age. And I think people, when they're thinking about privilege, they don't really think about the sacrifices that come from not having certain types of privilege. And even then, I'm still privileged in a lot of ways from my existence and being white and looking a certain way, being a certain age, you know. I've still got a body to sacrifice, whereas some people do not.
Yeah, and off of that as well, like I'm also self-funded, but I'm in a very interesting situation where I'm using American student loans, and I'm putting myself in a financial hellscape because my PhD is quite controversial. It was very difficult to try and get funded. There was other circumstances, including COVID, that really put a damper on it. And I could have waited around and trying to get funding, or someone could have snagged up my idea and done it before me, and then I would have to. So obviously these are very interesting, very unique situations that we're talking about. But even like we live in the same household, we pay almost the same rent, but I'm not working. Yeah. So I have more time to dedicate to the podcast, and I have more time to sleep than you. Yeah. You know, and these are like, even with me being a person of color, privilege is not something that is...
It's not fixed.
It's not fixed. It moves around. It's flexible. It's fluid. It's aqueous. So that is to say that privilege is a very complicated thing. And once more, this text is so rich. And it says so little, but yet so much.
We're going to start to wrap up the main idea that kind of the text leaves us with. And I'm going to start with a quote because, again, I just love Sara Ahmed's writing. And this is one of my quotes that I quote in loads of different things. So if you see me give other talks in other places, you might see this quote. She says, quote, "There is hope. They cannot mop up all our mess. One spillage can lead to more coming out. Can lead, does lead. Just loosen the screw a little bit, a tiny little bit, and you might have an explosion. We need more explosions." Again, I love it. There might be another quote coming.
Wait.
Snaps. So it's talking about how essentially if you're pushing the boundaries in the little way that you can do, there is other people pushing the boundaries that might leave space for people in the future to push the boundaries.
Student loan forgiveness in the States, just because you fought very hard to pay it off, wouldn't it be beneficial to future generations to have access to education without having to go through the same struggle as you? Why, if you suffer, must other people suffer?
So thinking about that is really, really interesting. And she talks about queer use becoming vandalism. And she gives this really beautiful quote again. Quote, decolonizing the curriculum as a project has often been framed as an act of vandalism, a willful destruction of our universals, knocking off the heads of statues, snapping at the thrones of the philosopher kings. End quote.
Sara,
it's so good.
it's so good.
And so to end on it then, Sara Ahmed says that queer use is the work we have to do to queer use. Again, sounds like a little bit of a oxymoron. Don't know if I'm using that word correctly. But essentially, queer inheritance is inheriting those small openings, the widening of passageways, secrets, meeting places, shelters, and information. Essentially, what you do now can be passed on to future generations. It's this passing down that allows that diversity work to not just become diversity work, but to become actual realized change. And yeah, I think that's interesting.
It is so deep, so I don't even want to add anything else. I think her words speak for themselves.
They're so good.
So good.
Sara Ahmed.
So when we don't have a fanfic, we use a piece of media. For me, I went towards, she's gonna laugh because I'm obsessed with her, but I thought of Mitski's Your Best American Girl. It was basically the section of the essay where she was talking about like paths that are walked on and the sort of negative effect of walking down that path. So it's specifically the second stanza, which is, you're the sun, you've never seen the night, but you hear its song from the morning birds. Well, I'm not the moon, I'm not even a star, but awake at night, I'll be singing to the birds. So it's about not being what your partner wants you to be, or not being able to fit into white society. That's why it's called Your Best American Girl. She is visibly Japanese. Her name is Mitski. And it's about the other person trying to make them fit into this box. And she's not a box, she is a sphere, or she's a triangle. Like, it doesn't fit in, and how exhausting it is, and how it also debilitates yourself because you're not able to blend in, because blending in would also be giving up a part of you. And then on the lightest of note, I thought of an art piece called Object by Meret Oppenheim from 1936. And it was a response for manufactured goods and fabrication in during this time period. So it was a very Marxist piece. And it's a teacup, saucer, and spoon covered in very expensive fur. I highly recommend you look at it. I got to see it in person when it was on display. And it's on view. So if you're in New York, it's the MoMA, the third floor on number 3 East. And it's really tiny. People usually don't see it when you come into the space. But this girl that I was working on a presentation with, this was the object that she chose. object. And it was about putting the saucer, getting the cup, putting tea in it, seeing the hair rise with the... Hannah's making a really nasty face, but seeing the hair rise with the liquid inside and then putting it to your lips and feeling on your bottom lip, you wetting the fur with your own saliva. And then the sensation of that liquid and the hair rubbing against the roof of your mouth. And you're like, you might be wondering, how the hell does this fit into Sara Ahmed? Well, it's about disturbance. It's about being uncomfortable. The use of this object is to drink out of, but it's impossible because it's covered in fur. So the fur itself is a form of vandalization and makes the object useless. And you have to either put it in the corner of the MoMA, or you have to drink out of it and just deal with the consequences of whatever that is. And I think, our historical background, I think it's a really good way to sort of think about physically and have that sensation in your brain, have that thought in your mind. It is uncomfortable. It doesn't sound nice. It doesn't taste nice. And that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. And it's not about being comfortable with the uncomfortable. It is about seeing why it makes you uncomfortable. And I guess on that note, I need to cut up this bread, baby.
I'm gonna go to the shop. Yep.
Yeah.
That was our thing.
Yeah, have the fur tickle the top of your mouth.
Yeah. Okay, with that. Thank you for listening. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information. And please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.